Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about biases. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, have you ever been have you ever unintentionally encoded your own biases and beliefs into the logic of your program you have developed for others? If so, how did you handle the situation? Well, this is I'm not sure if we're going for this modern definition, but I'm going to take this and make it my own thing. I have done this. I have made assumptions in my code based on my culture and what works here in my little part of the world and so forth, or how I think it works in other countries or other nations and so forth. And I got wise pretty quickly. I would like to think, at the very least, because after working on a few international projects where you have, this is actually one of the things that's probably, it's a bad thing and it's a good thing at the same time. I like to say to the Americans or the Chinese or so forth, like when you have a market that is that big, it's kind of nice. I'm not saying that they're not making international products. I'm just saying that you can go pretty much your entire career in a lot of at least mid-sized companies, if you're not doing international stuff, without having to deal much with the problems of nations and the differences between cultures, because you can have, you say, just English. You can have US dollars or some, you can sort of just assume a lot about your system that is very convenient and feels very natural to yourself. Most people, especially for me who has been working in many fields where I'm not an expert, like you need to have domain experts to sort of teach you a lot of things so that you understand what you're actually modeling. But one of the things that is nice and bad with being from Europe is that you have multiple languages, for example, and you think that that is it might be a straightforward thing, but it's actually an extremely complicated thing. And the same thing goes with different currencies, different ways of expressing like common things. My favorite one is addresses. One of the most common mistakes I've made in the past, or names like first name, last name, and like Mr., Mrs., Miss, like these different terminologies that we're using to express various things within our cultures. Those assumptions are very, very dangerous when you model them. A classic one is name. So usually a junior software developer will do something like, hey, this is a person's name, right? It's just a string, right? No, actually it's not just a string, because in a basic case you have a first name and a last name. And then you go a little bit further and you realize that actually we have middle names as well. How do we deal with that? Okay, but then you have other people who don't just have a first name, they have multiple names, like they have, these really, really, really extra, especially if you were talking, if I spoke to a coworker of mine who's from Mexico. I didn't actually know this, and don't tell me, like, I might be wrong here, but when you're from like from Mexico, for example, you might actually have, depending on how your family tree looks, multiple names, like multiple, like because the names that you adopt as part of marriage or things like that might look different from that of which works here in my part of the world, right? And when you start seeing that, you start finding out that actually when you model your data, it gets really important to understand the domain that you are going to model, because as I like to tell the software developers, the thing that most of you won't understand in the start of things, which I argue maybe you will understand, at least maybe I'm wrong, but I came to that realization later in my career, that the thing I'm actually trying to do here is that I'm trying to understand a domain, like a system or like a physical system, like a process in a factory or something like that, or rules in a society or rules in a company or something like that, how they work. And I'm trying to model those rules in code somehow. That's what I'm trying to do. And the better I get at understanding the domain that I'm dealing with, the more accurate my code will be in terms of logic and how it's going to work and so forth. And so if you make these mistakes, it can become very difficult for you. My favorite one was a story. This was amazing, I think. don't quote me if I'm saying the wrong thing now, but basically addresses. Now, something that I noticed that Amazon did, and I'm not going to claim that I know what Amazon does and how it works, like when you're buying things on them, from them and so forth, but something that I noticed was that when they express an address, they used address line first and address line second or something like that. In other words, they don't do the thing that most of my career I've been doing as part of the systems that I've been working on in my part of the world, where you have, you have your street, you have your house number or like your apartment number or things like that, postal code or zip code or something like that, and regions and so forth. You have that sort of structure. And my suspicion is that what they realized is that if you do that, it becomes very difficult. Like, you have to create quite a lot of different addresses, like models or like classes for an address, because the world has a lot of different ideas on what is semantic information when you're expressing an address. So when I, for example, started modeling systems like the same way, addresses for, I think it was the Netherlands or something like that, where they have a very, especially for the market that we were dealing with, power companies. Like, we were talking about companies who were providing electric services and meters and things like that. And the things that they needed semantically from the address were very specific. Everything from house number, like, that was not just something that was on the same line, which is the case here in Sweden, where you have the street and the number on this. It's just one thing, just as a name is a first name and a last name. But because I didn't know that when I created the original model, now my model doesn't work, because now the UI, the form that I have created for this application that's supposed to be international, actually needs to capture the house number. And here comes the next problem. It might not be the same position of the house number or the street number or something, similar sorts of things. You have very different semantics on how to write that thing, which becomes a nightmare for me, because now I have to make a very, well, I'm not saying like we had to make a compromise in this situation. We had to create a form that asked for input that fitted this model from people who would never have been interested in doing that. In other words, I had to send a form that made sense in the Netherlands, and so that they could order their products, right? But I had to send the same thing to the Swedes and the Danish and like the Germans and so forth and so forth. And to them, this doesn't make any sense, because they're not accustomed to having to fill out the information in the same fashion, if that makes sense. And so this is, as I said, I completely taken this from nothing, guys. I don't know if Amazon thought about this, but that's why I suspect that they structured it this way. Because if you're just going to, in our case, it wouldn't have worked, but if you're just going to print a label on a package and send it somewhere, it's easier for you to let that information be unstructured, just as a string, and trust that the user knows how to fill out the correct information, and just give them enough space to do free text, basically, because you don't have to parse it and convert it into something that has semantic meaning to your system. So what I want you to take away from this is that I have definitely had culture biases or nation, like things like that, as part of my coding, and it usually ends up with me modeling data in the wrong way. That's the thing that usually happens. I make an assumption about a first name or a last name, or people having a certain amount of names, or having certain formats of like how their birthdays are structured, or date, time, or addresses, or different pieces of logic. If you want to go into a real shit show when it comes to figuring all of that sort of stuff out, go into trying to make like salary systems for air travel companies or things like that, where you need to understand laws across like a spectrum of different nations and things like that. It can get really messy really quickly, right? And that is by far the most common thing I see. Like, people make these assumptions based on their own culture, because I was brought up in a world where, okay, I only have a first name and a last name. Why should anybody have more than that, right? That's usually what happens. Have a great day.